Welcome to another election special for WSIU On Topic. I'm Jennifer Fuller. We're now less than a week before the 2018 midterm elections, and in the last week since we last talked to you, the president has been in the district. So has former Vice President Joe Biden. We're talking about those issues and more today with John Shaw, the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at SIU Carbondale, as well as Linda Baker with the Simon Institute, and Todd Graham, who is the director of debate at Southern Illinois University. Thank you all for coming in, and let's start with that big name. John, we had the president in the district, we had the former vice president in the district within a week of each other. National names for a congressional race, is that a really big deal in your mind?
I think it is, and I think the 12th congressional district is considered one of the handful of really important races. Democrats believe they need to win it to secure a majority in the House. Republicans think they need to hold on to it to keep their majority in the House. So I think it's considered one of the maybe dozen races across the country that is considered a real bellwether race. And so all the heavy hitters have been coming in, the president, the vice president. Both parties have put tons of money into the race. I mean, it's basically a national election in the 12th district, I think.
We see this all the time when it's a midterm election, particularly in the first term for a president, that traditionally you'll see a larger number of the opposing party gaining seats in Congress. Do you think that that will happen this year, or could they buck that trend?
It seems still like it's going to be a good Democratic year. I don't think it's the tidal wave, the blue wave that people had been hoping for, Democrats were hoping for in the summer. But in this political climate, Democrats should do reasonably well. Although the economy is strong, which should work for Republicans. I think the general view is that the Democrats have a real chance of winning back the House. They need to pick up 23 seats. The most recent numbers I've seen suggest maybe 27, 29, 30. It looks like the Senate is still going to remain in Republican hands. So the House is considered the key sort of institution that's up for grabs. And I think the Democrats believe that they absolutely need to win control of at least one chamber to block the president, to possibly play a critical role in the investigations as they go forward, to make sure the Mueller report goes public. So I think the Democrats think this is amazingly important to win control of the House. So they are doing everything they can, including sending their heavy hitters to districts like the 12th and pouring lots of money into the race.
And of course, President Trump is expected to be in Cape Girardeau by the time Election Day rolls around next week. Linda, when we look at some of the issues that are coming out, when a national figure comes into a congressional district, how important is it that they know the local politics there instead of talking about some of the more national issues?
Well, I think it's really important, and healthcare reigns supreme in all of these districts. And when you think about the number of districts that are in play, and the fact that 4 of those are Illinois districts. We have Randy Holtgren, who was here with the president last week, along with Mike Bost. And then we have the Davis race, and Peter Roskam in the northern part of the state. So 4 of those seats that are in play are seats in Illinois, House seats. And so we have Illinois, the eye will be on Illinois on Election Day, and those are 4 of the key races, key seats that they're looking at taking.
Is that unusual at all, since Illinois is considered a blue state? You're talking about Republican lawmakers who are now perhaps in danger of seeing their seats flipped to a Democrat. Is that unusual to see that in a midterm?
I think it's very unusual. This is a very unusual year. I think about Peter Roskam. Peter Roskam is a long-standing member of the congressional delegation. He was a member of the House of Representatives. And having that seat in play, and as close as that race is, it certainly is something that is unusual. And I think that's why the president and others have been in Illinois, taking a good look and seeing whether or not they can swing it. But when you think about taxation, when you think about the economy, and the economy is good, but you also think about health care and the fact that we have had this attack on Obamacare, and we've been talking about pre-existing conditions. And so some of those issues that resonate with people locally, those issues are certainly front and center as we look at this midterm election.
Certainly a lot of the political ads that have been coming out over the last week or so really focus on health care, pre-existing conditions, big pharma, all those sorts of things. Todd, when you talk about messaging in any sort of campaign, let alone a political campaign, are you really looking to the dyed in the wool, I'm going to vote for this person no matter what, or is this swaying undecided voters?
Well, no, you really can't do that. Most of the studies in persuasion have indicated that political ads, no matter how much money you put into them, whether they be flyers, door-to-door, even ads on TV, they have actually a 0.05 view on persuasion. So they don't really persuade that many people. The people that they are able to persuade, whether it's from ads or stump speeches, the independents, if there are still some left, but mostly it can get people out to vote or get people to not vote. It's why one of the major campaigns for Trump in 2016, one of the Facebook misdirection campaigns that worked in his favor, was trying to get communities split against each other so that minority communities did not get out to vote for Hillary Clinton. So that's one of the things. So when you asked earlier if the big names coming to your district helped, I think it depends on the big name, because with every message, what we teach in persuasion is that there's two levels of persuasive content. There's both what you say, and that's fine. The Democrats would want to talk about health care, but it's also who is it that's saying that, because it might not be the wrong person with that particular message. And I'll give you an example. Donald Trump plays better in rural areas like this. Joe Biden plays better in rural areas like this, but Barack Obama wouldn't play as well in this area. So if you send the right messenger to the right independent community or the right community that might want to get out the vote, I think that's equally as important. And so it's important to pick the person who's a little bit more popular for that particular group of independents.
Certainly a strategy involved in that. John, when we talk to a traditional political watcher, they're going to talk about turnout, turnout, turnout. Who's voting and in what numbers? Does that change at all in the current political landscape?
I think so. I mean, in terms of like the presidential visit to Carbondale, in most years, a presidential visit would be very energizing for the party that the person represents. I think President Trump is such a polarizing figure that he very well could have boosted Democratic voting too. I mean, they reminding people exactly what they don't like. So I think with President Trump, a lot of the rules at least have been scrambled because he is such a polarizing figure. He has made a very clear decision not to run as a unifying candidate. And just some of his messages last week are explicitly focused on not only turning out the Republican base, but almost taunting the Democratic base, which I think might actually boost Democratic votes. So this is a very difficult year, but I think both parties feel like they really have to win the ground game to get their voters to the polls to prevail.
For any of you, how much does polling play a role in this last couple of days before an election? We saw 2 years ago that the polling was wrong. It was way off.
It was, and when you think about the fact that 24 million people have already voted, the early voting is a huge factor in this election. And of that 24 million, you have 42% of those individuals that have voted Republican, and then 40 voted Democrat. So when you think about it, both parties are getting out their base. Those are the people that are voting early. That list of undecided, and sometimes it's not undecided, I'm not going to say at this point who I'm voting for. And so those individuals are out there as well, and I think that's going to play a big role, especially in Illinois when we look at our Attorney General's race. The fact that the Attorney General's race is about 10 percentage points away, and looking at the Mike Bost race in the 112th, 1 percentage point. I mean, that is too close to call. And so those, the early voting and the polling, actually at this point, since so many people have already voted, it will be very interesting to see how these polls play out.
You mentioned that instead of it being called an undecided voter, it's almost an undisclosed voter, someone who doesn't want to say who they already have voted for or who they will vote for. When you're in a situation where you are the pollster, how does that affect your job and your predictability?
Well, it's certainly, I think if we look at the last election, I think that is one of the things that played into the outcome of many of the recent polls. People just are holding those conversations very close. And when we think about the polarization of the country in general, oftentimes people don't want to say. Oftentimes people don't even want to say these days to friends and neighbors because it has become so controversial, it is so polarizing, and many individuals are holding back on talking about who they're voting for.
John, the Simon Institute does its own poll, and that's something that institutes like yours all over the nation really pride themselves on, being able to know the pulse of, if not the region where they are, the nation as a whole. How does that change, this unwillingness to talk about their own politics change what you do?
Well, it really complicates polling. It makes it very difficult, and plus the explosion of cell phones and the decline of landlines. So it's getting harder and harder to just get a group of people, particularly for our poll, which requires 20, 25 minutes of substantial questioning. Not many people are willing to, or a declining number of people are willing to invest that much time into it. The other point I would make in terms of the polling, I think it's particularly important as to how parties invest their resources in this final week. And so a very, very close race might impel the Democrats to pour money, say, into the 12th district if they think Mr. Kelly is within striking distance. Whereas if the polls were breaking in the different direction and they thought it was that Boss was breaking away, they might pour their money into another race. So I think polls drive decisions in terms of spending and where people come. Some of the big people we're talking about, the president and former vice president, to come to districts.
And I'm sure we're going to see a continuation of that over the next several days. I wanted to get to what could be the outcome of this election. And Dr. Baker, we were talking before we get started here about, people are focusing on whether or not the balance of power in Congress will change. But this comes down pretty importantly in the state of Illinois in terms of whether or not there will be a Democratic supermajority in the legislature. How critical is that number?
Well, I think it's very critical. Illinois has had, on the Democratic side, a supermajority. That's 71, that magic number. The 71 actually puts you in a very good place as a Democrat because you're able to, that party will draw the map. And when we think about 10 years out, we think about the fact that we're getting ready to embark upon the next census. That party who has that 71 is able to have a core group of individuals as they go into map making season, as they start to have their map rooms in Springfield where individuals are going in and talking about redistricting and how it looks, and the fact that this year we'll probably, as we get ready to draw the map, we may even have fewer congressional seats. And so that is going to be very important. And also in the Senate. The Senate, their magic number is 36. The Senate wants to make sure that, and Democrats in the Senate are looking at making sure that they hang on to and have at least 36 so they have a supermajority. And so for Democrats, I think that's a key thing. The races that I think that most are looking at, especially at the local level, is the Attorney General's race. If in fact they can close the gap, and that Attorney General's race actually, after all of the years of having Lisa Madigan as the Attorney General, will Ms. Harrell be able to take that seat? That gap is closing, but clearly having 10 percentage points or so is off the mark of being able to actually close the gap, but it could happen.
There's a lot of messaging in that particular race between Erica Harold, the Republican nominee, and Senator Kwame Raoul, who is the Democratic nominee for Attorney General, about whether or not this is a vote against the Madigan name. Does that play a role in your mind?
There's been a lot of talk about the Madigan name in terms of some of the local races, and it's really not, I don't think it has really caught on the way that many think that it would have to begin with. But also when you think about the woman's vote this year, when you look at the fact the number of women that will have seats in the House of Representatives and the Senate, there will be more new members in the House of Representatives and the Senate than any time before in the history of this state. Over 60 new members of the legislature. So when you think about term limits, in Illinois, we actually don't have term limits, but when you look at the turnover, over 60-some new members between the House and the Senate. And when you think about suburban women walking into a ballot box and looking at all those names, one of the things that the question that's out there is when they get to the Attorney General's race and you have the woman on the ballot, do they vote for the female? I think that will be a telling piece in terms of how close that race is what Republican and suburban women do in that race.
We've talked a lot about how the Me Too movement, the Time's Up movement, these women's issues has really played into both the primary and the general election. Todd, in terms of the women's vote, in terms of women's messaging, is there a difference there? Is there something that's going to change the minds and hearts of women?
Well, I'm not sure what could happen between now and the election that would be any different than what they've been expecting. I think the Democrats were expecting a lot more women to turn their way, and in some ways they did. Like, for example, the demographics right now, the latest stats I looked at said that white women and who were like with education, minority women, et cetera, had huge leads for the Democratic Party. So they did make some, and especially they made some in white women who live in the suburbs areas. So they've made some of that. Now, is that true in all districts? Probably not, but that's probably already ingrained now. So at this point, we're just trying to, I think it's a portion of what's your persuasive message that you're trying to use. So we just talked a minute ago about more guilt by association. So tying somebody to Madigan. That works better in some cases than others, and so I'm just not sure how much tying a local candidate to a different candidate that maybe you don't really know that much about Madigan, you just know he's the boogeyman for Illinois. And so I don't think that's necessarily as persuasive. Republicans nationally are using a different tactic, which are mostly your fear tactics and talking about immigration. So those are sort of the two talking points. Now, I know a bit about fear tactics because I teach persuasion classes, and I can tell you factually that study after study indicates that we are more persuaded to take action based on fear of loss versus gain. So if I tell you you'll get $10, you're much less likely to actually do something for me than if I told you you'd lose 10 of your current dollars if you didn't do it. And so that's why Republicans and fear-mongering works pretty well. And they're centering that right now around education, from troops sending to the borders to the hordes and mobs that they keep calling people to the caravans. I even heard the phrase the other day on a national media which was called, well, you know, these people are military age that are coming here. And that's not even a phrase I think I'd ever heard before as described. And I'm like, oh, that's very clever in a way that, right, it's military age is a scary term. I hadn't heard that before. And so that's how you get out the vote. That's how you make sure people don't stay home. And a fear tactic has always worked pretty darn well.
Does that fear tactic follow people beyond the ballot box? Once we get past Tuesday, what does the message then become at a national level?
Well, that becomes more difficult because then do you try to follow through on that or not? And that's a whole different question. I think in some ways Republicans are a bit better at politics than Democrats in that they play the long game and they try to get more media on their side in the long run. They're playing, like Trump talks about the Supreme Court. I think he got more people to vote for him based on it's because of the Supreme Court than he did, and he's using the same tactic again. And so I think they look at the long and the short term. And like Linda said earlier, for the long term, Democrats should think about the redistricting and what happens in gerrymandering. While I think we could all agree that gerrymandering is not a good thing, and I would like it to be illegal everywhere, there's not a state that wants to step forward and say, take us first, because their state next to them gerrymander the other direction, and so they don't want to. So it's just a question of what happens after the election, and oftentimes the answer is on both sides, nothing.
John, you spent a lot of time covering Washington politics and how that whole national message really works itself into what happens within the Capitol there. How did things change in your mind on November 7th in Washington? Does all of this go back to what we were talking about 6 or 8 weeks ago, or does this message, the immigration message, the healthcare message, does that continue?
I think it's going to be a very ugly environment come January. I think the Democrats view controlling the House, as I said, is essential, largely to check the president. I mean, I think they really do not expect to advance a positive agenda, with a likely a Republican Senate, Republican president. So there's not even really much of a pretense of saying, these are the 10 jobs bills we're going to advance. I think it's basically controlling the institution to defend themselves against what they think will be a very, very contentious and explosive time when Mr. Mueller comes out with his findings, probably shortly after the election. And I think they believe control of the House is critical to making sure that that report gets a full public hearing. So I think that's, and even the Republicans, you would think with the economy as strong as it is, they would be pushing that message really, really hard, but they're really not. And it just seems that, I know as we were saying earlier about the politics of fear, but it seems like, when the economy is good, you should ride that as far as you can, and they've just chosen not to. It's really quite perplexing, I think.
When you talk about the Mueller investigation, there are a lot of people wondering whether democracy in the United States can recover from what has happened over the last probably 5 to 10 years and is escalating quickly. Do you think that it can? This is the ugliest time I've seen in my time watching politics, because the two parties are so locked in, and just it's becoming increasingly rare to find problem solvers really from either party who come together and try to negotiate. It's dangerous for a Democrat to be seen with a Republican and vice versa. So the environment is toxic. President Trump, as I said earlier, I mean,
his tactic has clearly been to, rather than to bring the country together after the election, to just drive in on his base and try to keep those people with him, hoping that if most of them or all of them stay with him, he still can get reelected. So I don't see a lot of compromise coming in Washington starting in 2019.
Todd, Linda, same question to you. Is democracy broken as a result of what we're seeing in elections today?
Well, clearly it has changed the way that Democrats and Republicans work together. In Illinois, for instance, we've always enjoyed, one of the things that I always enjoyed in terms of working in the State House is that there was always this thing called compromise. And it has happened on a few things in Illinois. The education bill that was signed and signed by the governor this year, clearly that was compromise. And so I think at the local level, at the state level, there is room for compromise. But if things work the way that the numbers have today, we will have Republicans that will be in the minority in the House, in the Senate, as well as the governor's office will also be Democratic. So we'll have all Democrats. And, you know, the art of compromise will certainly have to be there in a very different way. When we think about the fact that we still have a pension issue that we have to deal with as a state, we have a structural deficit issue that we have as a state. So there are many of the same issues that we had before the election that we still have as a state. We're embarking upon significant changes in the way we do healthcare in this state. We're trying to do managed care statewide. We're trying to put in health homes for people in Illinois to try to deal with some of the issues in rural Illinois in terms of the physician shortage. So clearly, the issues remain the same no matter who's in power. And so the question becomes whether or not the Democrats stay together and the Republicans that are on the outside come together for the greater good. And I could see that actually happening because I don't think we don't have a choice at this point.
Todd, messaging there, what would you coach these next group of lawmakers to say?
Well, here's the thing. You know, I think I agree that we are in a bad shape now. Now, I was not. I've heard and I've read that in the '60s it was much worse. That I was not alive in the '60s. I was totally alive in the '60s. But at least from what I can tell you is everything is recoverable so far. We can recover from it. But it's national and it's local politics and it's ugly. And it's one of the reasons why I, not doing polling, don't trust the polls as much. I feel like I'm an ordinary citizen who's now begin to think, well, why don't I trust them as much? And it's a little bit because of the last presidential election. It's a little bit because what you talked about earlier, sometimes we don't want to say things. And I think generally it's people who are pro-Trump supporters who are just like, I'm going to keep that quiet because I moderate tons of individual debates, family members and others. I'm just very good at this, right? I coach a debate team, so I'm very good at just when people are arguing, finding their best point, finding their opponent's best point and highlighting them both so that everybody's happy. It's hard to do that now. And I know everybody's best point, but as soon as I said something like Donald Trump had a good day a couple weeks back, I was visiting my mom and said, you know, Donald Trump had a good day. It was when we renegotiated NAFTA, and I think all things need to be renegotiated. Even the chief negotiator for the original NAFTA said, of course we should renegotiate it. And he had a good day. And as soon as I said, you know, he had a good day with this, two of the liberals in the family got mad at me, and I'm like, no, I'm just explaining what happened in the news. So there really is, there's a division not just on television or on Donald Trump's tweets or elsewhere, but there's a division among people that it's harder to talk to them. And I found it harder to find a middle ground when two people are arguing, and I'm pretty good at this, and I'm finding it more difficult to keep them on the same page and to try to get them to still enjoy each other's company at the end of the argument.
That's one of the reasons that we saw so many lawmakers deciding not to run for re-election, both at the state and the federal level. Is that right?
Absolutely. When you look at the number of individuals that did not run for re-election and the people that left midterm, we had lawmakers at the state capitol that just decided midstream, I'm leaving. And so it is because of the polarization. It is because that these are people who live in local communities who want to go to Walgreens or want to go to the local Walmart, and the issues have become so severe. But when you think about the fact that the budget situation has not been resolved and will have to be negotiated, the pension situation will have to be decided. And again, this whole issue of the structural deficit. Do we raise taxes or not raise taxes? And there have been a lot of commitments and promises that have been made on the campaign trail over the past year. And so how do we realize those gains without taking care of some of the things that have plagued us for years? And I think education in this state was a huge victory for Democrats and Republicans. And I think if they carry that same mantra forward, I think we'll see some change in the state.
Certainly a General Assembly 101 will be in place when we get into January. Will you see the same thing when you get to Congress? Will there be a huge curve in terms of the amount of information a new congressman or congresswoman has to learn in order to be ready to do these
Yeah, I
policy
mean,
debates?
there are whole classes that, that shortly after the election, they'll go to Washington and get training classes. Though even it used to be in the day there were bipartisan training sessions, and now they become increasingly partisan, so the Democrats and Republicans meet separately. Yeah, but there's a lot of complicated issues, and yeah, the huge issues that unfortunately I don't think are going to be resolved in the next 2 years. I think already the gearing up for 2020 on the presidential level will be intense. You're going to have 3 or 4 at least prominent Senate Democrats will be running for president, and they will be very prominent starting after the election.
With all that gloom and doom, with just a short amount of time remaining, Todd, you've been watching a lot of these national issues that have been coming out with Paul Manafort and the like. What do you expect to see over the next several weeks and months?
Well, I mean, I would, if you were doing guilt by association, I certainly would have tied more, and I'm sure in his reelection, Trump will be tied more to the people in his administration who are going to prison. I agree with John that in this particular election, Republicans should be focusing more on the economy because fear appeals work, but the only reason they work is if people are realistically scared of whatever you're doing. And I think some of this fear, even Republicans' conservative base are saying you're kind of drumming that up. That's kind of a fake fear. That's not really a fear of mine in Southern Illinois that I'm going to have. But the economy is real and it is doing well. And so I do think if that messaging changed, I think that would be better, especially for areas of the country like this.
You can catch the election returns on WSIU. Go to WSIUnews.org, or you can tune in on WSIU radio. That's 91.9, 88.9, and 90.3 on your FM dial. I want to take a moment just to thank each and every one of you for joining us, and the 3 of you for adding your insight into the next election. Linda Baker, Todd Graham, and John Shaw, thank you so much. You've been watching On Topic on WSIU. I'm Jennifer Fuller. Thanks for tuning in.